Welcome, everyone. My name is Adam Savitt. I'm Director of Communications at the Center for Security Policy. Welcome to the latest event in our webinar series. This one is entitled The Real Threat from Antifa, featuring Gabriel Nadalis, Dr. J. Michael Waller, and moderated by Kyle Shideler. Before we begin, I just have a few housekeeping items. First of all, you are in listen-only mode, but you can submit text questions. Look for the Q&A tab on your GoToWebinar control panel. And I will pass those on to the panelists at the end of the program. We will be recording this event. It will be archived on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/securefreedom, and it will also be on our website, securefreedom.org. With that, I'll hand it over to our Director and Senior Analyst for Homeland Security and Counterterrorism, Kyle Shideler.
Thank you, Adam. I appreciate that. This is a very timely presentation for us, for reasons which are, I'm sure, fairly obvious to all of our audience members. Those of you who saw President Donald Trump tweet out this week that Antifa should be designated as a terrorist organization may have asked yourselves, what is Antifa? Is it a terrorist organization? Can it be designated? What does that even mean? Many of you, as you see the riots and violence on your television screens, may be asking yourselves, where did these guys come from? How did this happen? And to talk to you about the origins of Antifa. Antifa, by the way, is short for anti-fascist, and the long form name being anti-fascist action. So we're going to talk about this dangerous group, where they came from, where they might be going, and what can be done about it with our panelists today. Joining me is Gabriel Nadalis. Gabriel grew up in the San Gabriel Valley in California. He's a graduate of Citrus College and is enrolled in the Northwestern California School of Law, where he hopes to one day practice constitutional law after passing the California bar. Now, Gabriel first became involved in politics in 2009 when he was a member of the left and eventually joined the Antifa movement. But eventually, becoming disillusioned with leftist politics, Gabriel reached out to conservative organizations in hopes to receive an alternative to the left's extreme views. And after graduation, he began to work at the Leadership Institute, where he helps students sue their schools when they engage in unconstitutional policies and liberal bias. And today, Gabriel speaks at universities across the country and has appeared on Fox and Friends, The Ingram Angle, Keeping Up with Jones, Tucker Carlson Tonight, and Varney and Company. And we're very proud to say that Gabriel will be one of the center's contributing authors in an upcoming monograph on the origins and nature of Antifa. So Gabriel, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Also on the panel today will be J. Michael Waller. Mike is a scholar practitioner in strategic communications and unconventional conflict. He's senior analyst for strategy at the Center for Security Policy and founding editorial board member of NATO's peer-reviewed Defense Strategic Communications Journal from 2015 to 2018, as well as a senior analyst at Wikistrat. He has a PhD in international security affairs from Boston University. And importantly for our work today, he received his military training as an insurgent with the Nicaraguan Contras. So he has a long background in responding to and confronting leftist guerrilla movements. And so I think he's going to be a really useful voice today on our panel to understand how these guys work. Mike is also president of Georgetown Research, a political risk and private intelligence company in DC, and is a guest instructor at the John F. Kennedy Special Warfare Center and School at Fort Bragg. So gentlemen, thank you for coming on today. I really appreciate it.
Great to be here.
Thanks, Mike. So let's start off with the basics. And I thought it would be useful, Gabriel, just to have you sort of tell people your story. How do people get recruited into Antifa? How are you recruited?
Well, you see, I was already a left-wing activist before I even joined Antifa. And I was active throughout my community for about 1.5 years until I saw on the news that a bunch of neo-Nazis were going to be coming down to Claremont, which is about 10 minutes from where I live. And that really fired me up, and I wanted to do something. And I had already read about Antifa, some of their tactics. So I decided to buy my gear, get a bandana, and just show up in the Black Bloc. That's where I met a lot of other left-wing activists who saw me and they liked what I was doing. I was actively participating in this protest. I was shouting, I was leading chants, I was very active. And they later invited me to many other events. And I think that that's basically how recruitment is working nowadays. But unfortunately, due to social media, it's been magnified. Now they don't have to actually wait for you to come to a protest. Now they're setting up all these videos and articles that they promote online through several different websites. And they look for people who are interested, who they see hope for, and they invite them to more radical protests.
That's really interesting. Mike, something that maybe our audience doesn't know about you is that in your early days, you also were recruited by radical leftists. Tell us about how that worked for you. How do you see comparisons or differences with Gabriel's experience?
Well, it's a lot of similarities. This was in the late 1970s, right after the left's victory in Vietnam, the defeat of the United States in Vietnam and its allies. And I was a high school student, and I was concerned for the environment. There was a nuclear power plant going up in my home state, and they were putting a 6-foot pipe for the hot water from the cooling system of the power plant, dumping it into the ocean, and I was afraid it was going to ruin the fish beds where I was always fishing with my dad and my grandfather. So I got involved as a naive kid, but not as a left-winger, just as an environmentalist. And they brought me in, and they gave us training, and I was trained to go. And when they train you, it's really cool and daring and exciting. So especially when you're in high school or college, you go in a canoe with bolt cutters and a couple other guys, and we were trained to cut through a chain link fence into the cooling to the containment dome of the nuclear power plant, which was then under construction, and then to spray paint anti-nuclear slogans on it. And of course, we didn't know this at the time, but we were setting ourselves unwittingly to be arrested and taken away, while of course the organizers, whose real names we didn't know, ended up getting off the hook. So they also trained us to how to confront the National Guard when the National Guard was going to come down and stop our protests, how to block streets, how to block traffic, how not to be scared, how to support each other, who the medic is, who to follow, what to do, and then to curl up into a fetal position with your hands over your head to protect yourselves from the batons and the boots of the National Guard. So it was quite an exciting experience.
This sounds familiar to you?
It kind of does. Some of the things, for example, a lot of people join left-wing politics not as radical activists, but as people who just want to protect the environment. One of the things that I personally did outside of the Black Mass was I was very involved in animal rights movements. And that's kind of how you start off, with something that seems like a noble cause. And then you get sucked up into this rabbit hole of radical activism, and you get more and more involved into the whole movement.
When did you realize, Gabriel, that Antifa was engaged in something illegal and violent you didn't want to be a part of?
Well, I've always kind of knew that there was something, we were doing things that weren't really lawful, but I'm glad, a couple of things. First, I'm glad that I never hurt anybody myself. I did some destruction of property and some things that, they're not nice to hear, but at least I didn't cross that line. That being said, the first time I really started questioning things was in high school, because I did this all while I was still a senior in high school. And I was introduced to economists like Milton Friedman and Thomas Sowell in my economics class, one of the only conservative teachers in the entire school, probably the only one. But that really I started to question left-wing politics in general. And I wanted to talk to other people about it, but the only people who were politically interested were also members of Antifa. So when I brought up to them like the tragedy of the commons, or just like the free market in general, they said that I was spreading capitalist propaganda. I always say that being an anarchist, that was the very first time I was called a capitalist pig. And I started noticing that they weren't interested about having a debate or talking about how to organize society to be better, because They say they're fighting fascism because we want a better society. Well, how do we build a better society? They're not interested in that the second part of that conversation. So I started reaching out to conservatives, and they actually, interestingly enough, they didn't really talk to me about politics. They recommended to me a lot of different books to read, but I became friends with them. And it was that friendship that really made me realize that a lot of conservatives aren't bad people. They're just people with different disagreements. And even if I disagree with them at one point, we can still sit down at a diner, at a restaurant, and just have a burger or something together, because I think that's basically what turned me. The idea that people are people, not political opponents.
Sure. And of course, we're talking about this, let's call it a system by which individuals are recruited in through what the left would call mass organizing, right, into then cells of behavior where they are increasingly encouraged to engage in more and more radical behavior, right? And if you look at, and so I should say, I recently published this week at the American Mind a brief look at the history of Antifa. And one of the things that was interesting to me was the role of the early 60s and 70s radicals in formulating what is now modern Antifa. I note ties to, for example, the Weather Underground and what was then called the May 19th Communist Organization. And if you look at their literature, I think it's interesting. They focus very much on the importance of a two-pronged method of encouraging mass organization and that broad spectrum of activity where they are bringing people in through environmental causes or animal rights causes, or people who are concerned about poverty, or any number of legitimate questions, right? But they are slowly marching them forward through a process to where anyone who disagrees with them is, as Gabriel said, a capitalist pig. Mike, in your experience with leftist organizing, how true does that ring to you? And what do you think about the historical connections here between anti-fascist action and the historical sort of communist militant movements?
Well, sure. Based on personal experience as a high school kid, they sort of try to take apart your identity when you get involved in these groups to prevent you from thinking critically. And then they get you to say what you think in a sincere way and then heap abuse on you because it's not part of their line, and they try to strip you apart that way. So with me, they said, why do you want to get involved in this anti-nuclear movement? And I said, well, I'm concerned about a nuclear meltdown and I care about the environment. And they said, stupid kid, we're here to overthrow American capitalism. Like, oh no. Well, that was my last meeting, and I never went back, but I realized how these guys work and found they had just gotten done spending the previous 10 years of their life supporting the enemy during war. They supported Ho Chi Minh in North Vietnam and the whole the people who were killing.
We're getting some notes from the audience about feedback. So if both of you gentlemen could mute your mic when you're not talking, that'll help clear up some of that feedback. So I apologize about that to our audience, and we'll try to get that cleaned up. Go ahead. I'm sorry, Mike. Please continue.
Yeah, sure. So it was a question of they had just gotten done supporting the communist enemy in the Vietnam War. My high school teacher got me involved, and of course he had me read the autobiography of Malcolm X and the Communist Manifesto. And I never read Common Sense by Thomas Paine or any of these other things in high school, because this is in the 70s. Okay, so imagine how it's gotten now. I was a student then. I would be almost retiring if I was a high school teacher now. So they have a deep ideology to overthrow our country and to overthrow our Constitution, and they'll work with foreign enemies to do it.
One of the things I think confuses people is, as Gabriel said, he joined in because he was told Nazis were coming to his campus and he wanted to do something about it because Nazis are bad, which seems somewhat self-evident, indeed is self-evident. But one of the things that's interesting, I think, in the projection of the sort of radical movement in the left was the transition from class struggle to the promotion of racial struggle. And you see this in the Weather Underground. When the Weather Underground splintered, there was an argument between elements of the left over promotion of class warfare or racial struggle. And the groups like May 19th went and pushed the racial struggle side over and above sort of a class warfare side. And so they began to promote this idea, which was already well ingrained, but they began to promote it heavily, that America is inherently racist. America is inherently white supremacist. And so when we hear them say, well, we're not opposing everybody, we're just opposing fascists, what do they actually mean by fascist? You'll see this on Twitter. Even some high-profile media people have, tweeted out messages saying, well, in World War II, our grandfathers were anti-fascists. Gabriel, what do they mean when they call someone a fascist? What do they actually, how do they actually view that?
Well, Mark Gray wrote the book Antifa, the Anti-Fascist Handbook. And in the beginning, he says that Antifa isn't really about fighting fascism. It's a form of revolutionary politics that rejects the idea to disagree or disagree. He quotes that quote by Voltaire that says, I may disagree with what you say, but I will fight to the death for your right to say. Well, he says Antifa stands to fight to the death from organized fascists to say anything. And then he continues on by saying, but it's not just fascists, it's the extreme right. And then if you look into the book, he defines the extreme right as everyday fascists. Well, what is an everyday fascist? A lot of the different examples he gives are just conservative students who are promoting free market ideas, who oppose socialism, who oppose communism. So they may give you the front that says, oh, we're opposing like fascists, but every time that they define it, it's just anybody who's not an anarchist, a socialist, or a communist, plain and simple.
Mike, talk to me about that trajectory. When did the left adopt what I think at one point was called the popular front idea, but this promotion of the left is the primary fighter against fascism, and then B, everybody we don't like is a fascist.
Right, and then they deny history, like fascism developed out of Marxism. Mussolini, who built fascism, invented it, had been a Marxist before. Everything he needed about community organizing and extremism came from his Marxist experience, and he just built that along Italian nationalist socialist lines. So yes, these guys can't exist without an enemy. There's no way to get people riled up if not much is wrong. So they create this fascist enemy to go after, but really, how many Americans have even met a fascist before? How many real fascists are they? And then they go around branding everything they don't like as fascist. Even MSNBC and CNN. You saw them trashing CNN headquarters the other day in Atlanta. They think CNN is fascist. So without that fascist, it's the same with the people branding everything as racist. Well, if you say something the wrong way, that must mean you're obviously a racist and a hater. So you go from class warfare to then racism to hate crimes to fascism, any extreme thing they can grab onto that's universally loathsome, and they get people energized for that. They can't exist without it.
And I will add that I recently did a webinar talking about, Antifa and like my story. I did this yesterday, and the university labeled me all right just because I left Antifa. So according to them, just because I oppose Antifa, I must be promoting fascism, which is basically, it goes down to their ideology. If you're not with them, you're against them.
Gabriel, talk to me a little bit, if you would, about the mindset of the average participant in Antifa. Particularly, I'd like to know, how much do they know about the organizers and leaders of the movement that they're in? How does organizing for these actions work?
Okay, so we have to remember that Antifa is not a traditional organization. It's a movement that encompasses multiple different radical groups. Some of them include, modernly, the Redneck Revolt, Young Democratic Socialists of America, Students for Justice in Palestine, By Any Means Necessary. I could list a whole bunch. But these groups do have leaders. And when you join one of the Antifa movement, you're typically a member of one of these groups. So you do understand that some of these leaders are promoting a specific type of ideology or a push. As far as the different mindset of each individual, they all see themselves as being self-righteous. I mean, going back to Mark Gray's book, I read it and I remembered exactly what I was thinking. I remember thinking, yes, we have to be the ones who are fighting in the front lines, because if we don't, there's going to be another genocide. We're going to have these hateful people and these people who are supposedly attacking minorities. They're going to win, and we have to stop that. So there's this self-righteous mentality that what we're doing is justified, because at the end of the day, we see ourselves as self-defense. But unfortunately, many of them don't realize that they're blinded by this self-hatred or self-righteousness and hatred of other people, and they start attacking people who are just peacefully engaging in discussions.
Mike, you're nodding your head as he describes leaders being distributed out amongst a number of different organizations. How does that compare to your experience with the organization of the communist fronts of the 80s?
The only change is the names and the faces, and even some of those are the same from before. Everything that Gabriel's talking about is old stuff. The only real difference being that because it's easy to break up a network if it has a vertical hierarchy, it has leaders, and you grab a couple of them, and then one of them cops a plea or gets intimidated, and then that person, once arrested or sued or whatever, ends up exposing the whole network or allowing others to do so. So the idea of having a horizontally distributed network, like that swarms like a hive of bees rather than comes at you in a structural form. This is something that Al-Qaeda started from a terrorist perspective. It's something that ISIS was, where anybody could be a member of ISIS just because they said so. It ultimately had a leader, because all of these movements have a leader. It's not completely amorphous, but this is the way you prevent it from getting broken up, and this is the way you can make it grow very quickly without having an organization.
And Mike, when you were so for those of you who don't know, Mike Waller served as a member of the Active Measures Working Group, helping the Reagan administration counter Soviet subversion. How did you guys, Mike, approach these organizations when you were active in that campaign? And what could we use from that today? What would need to be adapted?
Sure. Well, first, I wasn't a member of the group. Those were senior government officials, but I worked for them to help them. And what we did was, learning from my experience on the left, we joined and infiltrated communist front organizations and radical groups that were either Soviet supported or as part of the Soviet Active Measures network, whether they realized it or not, or were supporting foreign communist insurgencies like the FMLN guerrillas in El Salvador or the Sandinistas in Nicaragua or whatever. But because the old US Communist Party wasn't at all appealing, young people didn't want to join. It wasn't any fun. It was run by these stodgy old geezers and so forth. So they wanted to do something more fun and more cool, and also more libertine, because the Communist Party had a discipline to it. So you couldn't live a more hedonistic or bohemian lifestyle as a party member, because you're too prone to getting busted by the cops. So they split off, along with, say, Angela Davis and that generation of people, and set up their new, more Che Guevara style leftist movements, and took inspiration from a new and more exciting communist movement, which was Mao Zedong's China. I think it's very interesting that you don't hear much about the Chinese being involved in these kinds of activities, because to our knowledge, they haven't really been since the early 70s, perhaps, and they changed their policy for peaceful development and cooperation to some degree with the U.S. But the daughter of Ulrike Meinhof, just a couple of days ago, Ulrike Meinhof was a leader of the Baader-Meinhof gang of Germany in the 70s and 80s, became the Red Army faction. It was an urban terrorist group, and she wrote a piece in a Zurich newspaper. We have an English language summary of that up on the Center for Security Policy site last night. showing that the real heir to this movement, it was a terrorist movement. They assassinated businessmen and police and military people and so forth. Antifa is the heir to that movement. And she said the only difference between Antifa and the old Red Army faction, Baader-Meinhof gang, is that Baader-Meinhof gang did not conceal their identities. She said it's the only difference. It's a very important distinction to make because she was raised in the Baader-Meinhof gang and she knows this ideology. She opposes it, but she opposes it from the left. But she gave an excellent study. So there's this interlinkage between what we're seeing in our streets today and hardcore terrorists. You've noticed those two New York attorneys who were arrested the other day throwing Molotov cocktails at New York City police car. And this is an attorney who worked in the Obama administration as an intelligence official. She worked in the National Security Agency and the Defense Department at the Pentagon. She wrote part of the president's daily brief, and she recruited Muslims to work inside our national security apparatus. And I'm sure these had to have CARE approval. She got a scholarship from CARE and these Muslim Brotherhood fronts. And her buddy, who was photographed throwing the Molotov cocktail, was wearing a Palestinian radical mask when she threw the gasoline bomb. And then this Obama person didn't take part in the crime, but did raise $250,000 to post bond for her. So you're seeing this link now with people in senior posts in the United States government who are tied to terrorists.
Yeah, Gabriel, talk to me about that in the sense of the support that we see from individuals on what we might think of as the ordinary left or the mainstream left who come out in support of Antifa. You mentioned Mark Bray's book, the Antifa Handbook. Of course, there's a very famous picture of now Attorney General for Minnesota, Keith Ellison, holding up that book very proudly. What is your experience with that? What is your view on that?
I mean, Keith Ellison is not alone. He's just one of the higher officials that promotes that Antifa mentality. I mean, his own son, who is a council member in I forget which town in Minneapolis, I think Minneapolis, Minnesota. He's a council member, and he said, oh, I support Antifa. Then there's also Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who, when Boston Antifa got in trouble, they sent him off to jail for assault and battery. She started fundraising to bail him out of jail. But not only that, I remember in 2017, now as a conservative activist, that I was in Oakland just to help out some conservative students. I attended an Antifa march from Oakland to Berkeley, in which I saw one of the council members for, I'm pretty sure it was for Berkeley, I'm not 100% sure, one of the local council members saying that she was Antifa and that she supported Antifa. And then everybody started marching saying, I am Antifa, like all of these crazy things. There's far too many elected officials who support Antifa. And I think it has to do with the fact that the Young Democratic Socialists of America are actually sponsoring a lot of local elections. If you look at some of their press releases, they'll say, oh, we just got 15 members elected to this state house or that state house, and it's all throughout the country.
Right. So, Mike, you raised a question that I think is worth analyzing as we move forward. One of the things I mentioned upon the introduction was President Trump's calling for the designation of Antifa. And as we noted in our decision brief that we released yesterday, calling for the designation of Antifa as a foreign terrorist organization, the group does in fact have foreign links and foreign relationships. And one of the ones that I've highlighted in past writing is ties between Refuse Fascism and what used to be called the Nicaragua Network, which is a pro-Sandinista group I'm sure you're very familiar with, Mike. And of course, you mentioned what the heir to, if you can call it the heir to Baader-Meinhof, said about that. What have you seen? We'll start with Mike and then go to Gabriel. What have you seen regarding the internationalization of Antifa and its behavior, and can we designate?
Sure. Well, these movements have been international for decades, and Antifa is an import. It came from Europe to here. Even Ulrike Meinhof's daughter, former terrorist daughter, even said in her recent article that at least one member of the group had had operational relations with the East German intelligence service, the Stasi. So we have Soviet bloc intelligence involvement in this. We know there's Cuban intelligence involvement in some of the older groups that are still active with Antifa today. So these are foreign government directed, or at least foreign government influenced movements for the purpose of disrupting and destroying our system here inside the United States. So they're very certainly foreign terrorist movements. And I always objected to the designation violent extremist because I thought it was a cop-out, but now let's use that now. And if they're not going to accept the label terrorist, let's get the left to accept the term violent extremists, because you can't quibble with that one. So under the law, we're able to designate Antifa as a foreign terrorist organization, as you and Chris Holton described in the decision brief. The trouble is the law doesn't apply that well domestically for those same purposes. So we'll have to use, there are plenty of other laws on the books to go after these guys. The trouble is it's not a real organization. So it doesn't have a formal membership list. So we can't simply designate so-and-so as helping a terrorist group if it's not exactly a group. So I'm sure Attorney General Barr and others have some good lawyers who will work on this.
Right. That is one of the challenges I described it in my article, The American Mind, as sort of amorphous flesh and sinew over a bone structure. And the question is how to get at that structure that enables these behaviors. Gabriel, to you, your thoughts on designation and Antifa as an international movement?
Well, I know a little bit of the history of the international movements, but mostly I never dealt with any of that. All my experience happens to be domestically. And what I can tell you as far as the terrorist classification, I've been calling for a domestic terrorist label for about a year now, and because they fit the exact definition of terrorism, which is to promote political ideology through violence and intimidation. That's what Antifa does. But we really have to be looking at where this is coming from. And at the Leadership Institute's campus reform, we always talk about how so many liberal professors are playing a part in growing this anti-American and anti-conservative movement. For example, at the University of Texas A&M, right now, a left-wing radical Twitter account reported some conservative students, and the university's Twitter account, official Twitter account, thanked them and said, like, oh yes, we're monitoring these hateful people. And it may seem like a little thing, but it's unfortunately happening at so many universities, and it involves, it takes the Antifa from, or rather left-wing activism from just discussions and opposing conservatives to taking action, not just against their ideas, but specifically against their right to free speech, and then against them personally with intimidation and violent attacks.
Right. We are getting some good questions from our audience, so I want to take a look at some of them. I think they're worth talking about. Mike, this one is for you. And the audience member asks, what is the applicability of counterintelligence tactics that were developed to target cellular networks, like, for example, the provisional IRA, when looking at Antifa's looser and ad hoc cellular structure? Is there a role for counterintelligence here?
Well, there's a role for counterintelligence to the extent that foreign intelligence services are exploiting our political system and trying to sow divisions and unrest in our country. So absolutely, but counterintelligence applies to foreign intelligence services. Mm-hmm. But there's also a counter-subversion part of U.S. federal law that people don't like to talk about because it sounds McCarthyistic or whatever. But since Hillary Clinton is the one who brought up Russian subversion during the 2016 campaign, I think it's fair to, not only fair, but we have bipartisan support now for reviving that concept. I mean, the federal law mandates the FBI to monitor and combat subversion of our political system, where people are operating outside the constitutional means, trying to use violence instead of civil discourse. So there's very definitely a role there. We do know that the FBI has had warned the Obama administration about Antifa, and the Obama administration chose not to consider it. But the FBI said in 2016 this is an organization or a network that either does or will be a terrorist entity. So we have to watch that. There are still a lot of problems within the FBI now. There are some fine agents and fine analysts, but a lot of the nerve center of the Bureau has been taken over by people who are literally denying that Antifa should be called a terrorist entity because it doesn't, quote, engage in terrorism. And when you have,
when the FBI used to deny there was such a thing as the mafia.
yes, so you now, if you look at what happened when the FBI had very robust capabilities to infiltrate and counter and even disrupt these subversive organizations up through the 70s, you had, after Watergate, those organizations and their friends who were working in law firms or the media or politics had a very aggressive movement to strip the FBI of those capabilities, which is exactly what happened in the 1970s, and they were never really restored.
Gabriel, I want to get to something you said about what's going on campuses and the role played by professors here. And one of the things I think is most concerning to me about Antifa, in a way that is not as concerning with other threats, such as the Islamic State or various white supremacist groups, is the level at which the ideology has penetrated both the academy and sort of the general conversation. I'm thinking about things like, for example, the 1619 Project, where the New York Times promotes this argument that the US is founded on white supremacy. How do these sorts of call them mainstream endorsements of the ideology, how will that play with the members of and supporters of Antifa? How do they view those sorts of statements? How do they use them? And then how is that going to sort of help them grow?
Unfortunately, we have so many left-wing professors who are just cheerleaders for Antifa. And then it comes from the fact that they see themselves as activists first and educators second. And in fact, so many of them went into academia specifically to promote left-wing politics. They're not just something, it's not just something that they believe in and they said, I should teach in my class. No, their purpose is to promote the leftist ideology because they want to subvert American institutions and instill their idea of left-wing socialism because maybe it'll work this time. And unfortunately, so many people, you can just point at so many professors at so many universities. Mark Bray is one. Gerald Dixon from the University of North Carolina is another. Yuan Poon from Colorado State University that promote this type of bias and abuse against conservatives. And it is all a form of revisionist history. They don't like our ideas. They don't like the fact that we support free speech, that we support the Second Amendment, that we support basically law and order. So they want to go ahead and subvert that in any way possible, which is why they're targeting institutions such as higher education, because that's how you really take down America, through our institutions, by convincing people that we were in the wrong. But even though America has made mistakes in the past, the fact speaks for itself. America has provided more freedom and more liberty for millions of people, even around the country, and just because of our founding ideals.
Sure, Mike. I mean, you were a professor. What are the challenges with the academy?
Oh, they're huge. But first, this recruitment starts in high school, and really, it can start a lot sooner if you look at what the National Education Association Teachers Union is pushing on small children, kindergarten children, to indoctrinate them at a level that's really soft, so that if a parent complains, the parent comes off looking like a nut. And this goes on throughout, not learning who Christopher Columbus was, or having the kids write essays about how Christopher Columbus chopped off indigenous children's hands and sold them into slavery, or some awful things, and nothing about his wonderful achievements. It's just some, so it makes you hate America. It's the Howard Zinn version of hate America history. To hate everything we stand for, whether it's Judeo-Christian religion, whether it is Western civilization, Western culture in general, the classics, classical philosophy, American democracy, everything that's good is evil in the eyes of the education profession.
Statement about Howard Zinn makes me smile because I was just recently rereading the Prairie Fire Manifesto. And for those of you who don't know, the Prairie Fire Manifesto was the manifesto for the Weather Underground. And one of the things they say is about the either need for or the great power to be found in a people's history, which of course is what Howard's entitled his book. And so, and of course, this is not entirely coincidental when you consider that many of these 60 radicals, guys like Bill Ayers and Bernardine Dorn, became accomplished professors and educators and promoted a great deal of work in so-called reform of education. So I think that it's important to keep that in mind when we say, you know, the average parent looks at the stuff that their kid brings home. They say, how did this get here? Well, it was put there.
Yeah,
and deliberately.
And Howard Zinn, for example, I knew him at Boston University when I was a grad student. I wasn't friends with him, and we had a couple unpleasant encounters. But his whole purpose was to teach History 101 to the gullible incoming freshmen, and to indoctrinate them from the first day of school in the fall, and then they're set for the rest of the time there. And that was his special purpose. This stuff is organized and it's ideological, and there's no accident why a book like his is such a popular sort of a go-to book. When it came out at first, the mainstream education profession, the professional education profession, brushed it off as kook, junk pop history, and now it's mainstream.
Right, and I'm sure that we will see, if it's not stopped, a similar response to the 1619 Project, where many
they link together,
but then very soon becomes a manual for teaching. I think it's one of the challenges that we have, that on the one hand we are looking at Antifa, a violent revolutionary organization that engages in what can only be described as terrorism. Yet in order to have this discussion, we also have to be able to talk about the behaviors of professors and the academy and mainstream media thinkers. This is one of the challenges of discussing Antifa, that they are not they're not wholly alien to the left, in the way that there's not really a whole lot of objection to targeting Islamic State, for example. You do have networks like the Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamists who certainly oppose that, but they're relatively foreign in an ideological sense to the United States. Where in discussing Antifa, you're talking about concepts and ideologies that are deeply now, certainly since the 60s, now deeply ingrained in American academia. So it creates this challenge for us. But it's important for us to think about and how we can, on the one hand, do what is necessary on the law enforcement side, while also doing what needs to be done in the educational sphere. And so it may seem strange for us to have that conversation together in one event, but both of those conversations are necessary. I hope you'll agree. Gabriel,
when you see police officers and uniformed National Guard personnel taking a kneel in front of these extremists, it's a sign that the system's breaking down. Complete lack of professionalism, and they're there effectively bowing to and saluting with their knee these, not just the radicals themselves, but a political and ideological movement, when the police and the military should be completely neutral.
Gabriel, I'd like to ask you a question about if you saw or you viewed any ideological cracks in Antifa and in the left. I've seen people say, Antifa claims to be very pro African American, very pro minority, but in fact is very, in their behavior, very racist. Did you see any evidence of that? Are there cracks in this movement that could be dealt with?
I think that's very bad. I wasn't sure what you were asking at first, but I remember one of the anti-neo-Nazi protests I attended, And at first we saw all the police defending or just setting up a scrimmage line to prevent violence. And being from Southern California, a lot of them are Hispanic, a lot of them are African American, because that's just the population of Southern California. At first they were telling them, myself included, although I didn't say any racist remarks, saying, hey, you can just go home. Like, come on, you don't have to be here, just go. But when the police said nothing and they just kind of, kept a stoic face, then there was a lot of members of the Black Bloc who started calling them race traitors and really hateful things, saying that they were the ones that were siding with the oppressor. And even for myself, like now as a conservative, I often hear at some of the events that I've been called a coconut, which is brown on the outside but white on the inside, and all of these really hateful language. So they may be say that they're promoting diversity and all of these different like good feel things, but when you look at their actions, they don't really care about that. They're using the same like type of us versus them mentality, and they'll use anything to their advantage.
Right, and I think that, that's worth highlighting in this most recent disturbance, the civil disturbances we've seen across the country that have been Antifa influenced and led. The deaths of now a number of including minority police officers who have been, I think you can only describe as assassinated. Law enforcement officers shot at close range or from behind by law enforcement, and nobody is talking about how what they claim to be doing, which is standing on behalf of George Floyd, a man who was killed by a Minneapolis police officer, a black man killed by a Minneapolis police officer, but they are themselves killing African Americans, African American law enforcement, African American security guards, destroying shops owned by all manner of people, all manner of Americans, white, black, and Hispanic. And I think that this is an important point to raise, and to make clear that there's a difference between their words and their actions. Mike, from a political warfare point of view, how do you exploit I hate to call it an opportunity, but a wedge between a organization's behavior and its rhetoric?
Well, there are a lot of ways to split movements or entities like this, especially if they're hypocritical, like this one is, where they really don't, Black lives really don't matter. They only matter in order to create a spark to light that prairie fire that we were talking about. So it's almost as if it's pre-programmed in there. Once there's police brutality against an African American, that's the trigger for people, the most extreme ones, to jump out into the streets rather than do what we would do in any case. And it's fine to protest, that's fine, but this is to come out and commit acts of violence. There's ways to split that, where unfortunately our leaders have a long way to go in doing that. They're trying. First of all, there were some great statements out of the White House and the administration of support for coming out and protesting police brutality, and in this specific case as well. And then an announcement that they would make sure that the officers involved or alleged to be involved or actually involved are prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, and we just can't have this anymore. That's great. But what we don't do effectively is to take advantage of those divisions that you're seeing, because most of the people involved are not crazies. They're not Antifa. They don't hate our country. They don't want to overthrow our government. So peel them away, divide them, and then peel the politicians away and divide them. Some of them are doing that. The thing is, if say this White House gets involved, it might have an unintended effect of bringing them closer together. But you can say, oh, come on, you don't really support that violence, do you? Then why are you hanging out with them? Why are you in the streets with them? Why don't you have your own protest someplace else? Why don't you work with the police? And you do see this. A lot of the protesters are putting circles around police who have been attacked and throwing some of these people out and leading police to these pre-stationed pallets of bricks and whatever else. I don't know who found the pipe bombs near the Lincoln Memorial, but somebody did. So you do have some of that, but what needs to be brought out more is, are you guys with the terrorists, or are you just with the peaceful protesters? And do you want to be lumped in them to corrupt your cause?
Gabriel,
one of the things that's been very dangerous is when you have politicians coming in and siding with the extremists against civil society and using that for political purposes.
Gabriel, and this is piggybacking on a question from a member of our audience. What is the relationship between the so-called regular protester and the Antifa members? You talked about being a member of the Black Bloc. For those who don't know, a Black Bloc is a organized street action where members all dress in the same color, wear masks, and essentially operate as a battalion of anarchists to fight, to engage in street fighting. But what is the relationship between the other protesters and the Antifa when these actions break out?
So to bring up Mark Bray again, he wrote an op-ed in response to Donald Trump classifying these activists as domestic terrorists. And he said that Antifa does not have the power or the manpower to really do all of the protests and riots around the country. He's in part right, but what he failed to, I'm pretty sure he knows what I'm about to say, but what he failed to take notice of is a political tactic called propaganda by the deed. Propaganda by the deed means to enact political violence against somebody in order to inspire others and to get them to say, hey, they got away with it, I can too, like I'll join them. So not every single rioter out there is part of Antifa. Now, but if we see some of the cities that where the rioting first started, St. Paul, Minnesota, and Chicago, Illinois, Portland, my home in Los Angeles, California, Austin, Texas, all these cities, Antifa has been operating for decades. Under the guise of regular anti-fascist activism. That's where it started, and then that spread to regular communities throughout the country.
You mentioned some of these organizations that Antifa pulls from, radical left protest organizations. Are they often the official organizers of these protests? I mean, what is the role of the official organizers versus the Antifa activists? Are they surprised when Antifa shows up? I
wouldn't be able to tell you if they were official organizers because I can't point to specific people. But I doubt that they're surprised that Antifa shows up to these things. As a matter of fact, I can point to some people. Now thinking about it, Daryl Dixon from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, he's the leader of his chapter of the Redneck Revolt, which is a self-identified Antifa organization. And he does a lot of activism. And so I'm pretty sure, although I can't say for certain, that some of the leaders are heavily involved directly with anti-fascist activism. I just wouldn't be able to point to one directly because I'm just not as involved anymore. But I will note that I saw this short video by Project Veritas from Jason O'Keefe, in which a member of his staff infiltrated Rose City Antifa. And let me tell you, there's a reason why Rose City Antifa is one of the oldest consistently organized Antifa chapters, because they mean serious business. I mean, some of the tactics that they set for recruitment, they're nothing that I ever experienced. They're saying having him wait at Starbucks so he can be identified. Although I will say that I did notice that their meetup was at a local bookshop, radical left-wing bookshop. I've known this to be the case all the time. You have to look at some of these collectives. I frequented some in Los Angeles and Southern California in general, where a lot of left-wing activism or activists organize.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Gabriel, about looking at how these known radical collectives then participate in or help facilitate these behaviors. I wanted to ask either of you, feel free to take it, whoever would like to, what would your next steps be if you were the president, what would your next step be? Gabriel, I'll go with you, and then Mike, you can take a swing at it as well.
If I want, I mean, right now what President Trump did was a great first step, but now we actually have to see some meat behind the plan. I want to see some members being that are being arrested and charged with domestic terrorist laws to really look at their networks, because oftentimes you'll find connections to either politicians or other networks that are much more active than just that one individual. So that's really what I would do. Every single person who is being arrested, we have to investigate their affiliation. For example, there's this kid, 20-year-old kid who was arrested, whose parents marched with him to surrender himself to the police because he started some riots. A lot of people may have not noticed, but the bandana he was wearing had the ALF logo, which is the Animal Liberation Front, which was incredibly active in the 90s, and that they were being prosecuted back then as domestic terrorists. So I'd be very, very curious to know if he had any connections to those groups and see what they are up to.
That's a sharp eye, Gabriel. I appreciate that that little tidbit. Mike?
Well, there are a lot of things to do. First, you have to round up a lot of them, so not a few of them, because you can't have identifiable heroes among this who become cult figures. So you have to round up a lot of them, and the law demands that this be done. So that's just the street level people, but the street level people aren't the ones who are making this happen. It's the funders. And we have to go after the funders who are funding a organized criminal conspiracy to cause economic destruction and to assault people and to commit acts of murder. This is the same thing you use to go after the mafia. And while I think it's very important to pursue counterterrorism methods, anti-terrorism methods, anti-criminal conspiracy methods are just as effective and could even be more effective. This means going after the billionaires and the foundations and even some of the Hollywood people who provide material support for these movements, fully knowing where the money is going.
And one point I think is worth making is that in many states there are civil RICO charges that individuals, private plaintiffs can sue under RICO. So for the lawyers,
racketeer, influenced, and corrupt organizations statutes.
That's right. So some of the lawyers out there, I think, should be aware of that there are I hate to put it bluntly, but there are opportunities for you to find a plaintiff who has been injured by these groups, and with proper research help, figure out who paid for these behaviors and get justice for these victims. I think that's very important. I would make one pitch for a piece of legislation that the center has supported in the past, which is called Andy's Law. It's a state level piece of legislation that allows for increased attorney's fees against groups that engage in material support for terrorism. So those who help recruit and train and fund and support these acts of terror can be targeted under something like Andy's Law to get justice for victims. And so I think that's something we should look at, because this is really a civil society problem. Obviously, we expect more from our law enforcement. We expect them to crack down on Antifa and deal with them, but it's a civil society problem, and there are opportunities, I think, using the proper piece of legislation for attorneys and plaintiffs to get justice. So we should, I think, encourage that as well. And if you have questions about that, you can reach out to the center, and we can help put you in touch with somebody on how to get Andy's Law or similar legislation in your state. So that would be one suggestion I would make as well. Gentlemen, this has been a really great discussion. I appreciate very much you joining us today. For those in the audience, I would encourage you to check out Mike's piece on the origins of Antifa as described by one of the children of the Baader-Meinhof gang. A really interesting piece. And if I may engage in a bit of self-promotion, I would also encourage you to check out a piece on the history of Antifa, which I wrote for the American Mind, and is also available on the center's website. And to plug an upcoming work by the center, we are preparing as we speak a monograph on Antifa, its history, its origins, and how to respond. And Gabriel has an excellent chapter that's going to be in that monograph that I'm going to encourage everyone to check out when it goes to publication. And we will, I'm sure Gabriel will be speaking to you again as that publication date becomes closer. Unfortunately for all of us, I don't think Antifa is going to go away. So this is going to be a topic that we're going to need to revisit again. So gentlemen, I appreciate your attendance. I thank the audience for their very excellent questions. And I encourage everyone to check out our upcoming panels and webinars here at the Center for Security Policy. And you can go to securefreedom.org in order to do that. Gentlemen, thank you very much.
We'll see you.